Hey everybody, welcome to week 2 of Rock Music History and Appreciation. Hope you're all doing well. Congrats on getting it through week 1. You only got 15 more to go, so the end of the class will be here before you know it. So last week was orientation week. Last week was basically me getting you all set with everything you needed to do so that we were all on a level learning playing field. That was at least the goal. So you learned about Canvas, you learned about how to learn and study, you learned about neural nostalgia. You hopefully are a little bit farther ahead on the game. I know that we had some folks that were waiting till the last minute, some panicked people. Again, these Welcome to the Week videos are due by noon on Thursday. Last week, I actually had kind of overkill on the announcements. I sent out one on Monday, I sent out one on Wednesday, and I sent one out on Thursday morning. That's the last time that I will do that. So basically, I only usually send out a couple of announcements. I send out a Thursday announcement, just saying, hey, saying, hey, here's what's due today, which for Thursdays is always your Welcome to the Week videos are due by noon on Thursdays, and your initial discussion prompt is due by the end of the day. Now, your goal is to ideally watch these assignments and get them done by Monday or Tuesday, because you're going to start going through the materials. Because last week were kind of gimme assignments. It was the meet and greet. You didn't really have to do anything. But as we move into this, it's going to get deeper into its connection to the materials. So you won't really be able to answer the discussions and the reflection observations in a meaningful way unless you've already gone through the materials. And by that, I of course mean the book, and I mean the online materials, and they are different. So it's not an either kind of thing. It's a both, right? It's a combination so that they are reinforcing each other. And don't forget about those playlists. The idea of this class, again, like I said, is it's all about the music. So I want you to be listening to the songs, because I'm going to tie back to songs. And I want you to pay attention to music. What's happening? Is it fast? Is it slow? What instruments do you hear? But I also want you to pay attention to the words. And it's crazy how many times over the years, both face-to-face and here, I've talked to students that are like, oh yeah, I hardly ever pay attention to the words. Now, granted, there are pop songs where the words are throwaway. And I'll give you a perfect example of a song you probably all know and love, which is the song Happy by Pharrell. It's got some really dumb lines in there. To say that you're happy like a room without a roof, that makes no sense. But whatever, right? It's got a great beat. You can dance to it. But I want you to pay attention to the words. I want you to pay attention to what the songs are saying, because sometimes they're shallow and sometimes they're just love songs, but sometimes there's great depth, or there's, other meanings and things that are going on. So you'll get asked questions about those things. So I'm expecting that you're listening to the music. That's the fun of the class, okay? Just so you know, I can keep track of how much time you are. I think I mentioned this in the last one, but just so you know, I can keep track of how much time you've spent online. So I've had students reach out to me and say, I'm really, I'm struggling, or this, or I missed this, or I did that, or whatever. And I go to look and they've spent like 15 minutes in the class where they should have spent 10 hours. Well, there you go, right? There's going to be the trouble. There's going to be the difficulty. You should be spending about 5 hours, roughly. It says 5 to 10, 5 hours thereabouts on I think a week. Some modules are shorter than others. I know full well that you could just log into Canvas and keep it running and build up the time. So I know you can game the system that way. But if your goal is to get on there and just to like click, get to whatever, you're missing the point of the learning. And as I've said, and will continue to say, it is about the learning. So last week was intro stuff. This week, we're going to start getting into the music. So this is history of rock music history and appreciation. Rock and roll proper that we'll learn about really was only about 5 years or so, 1954 to 1959-ish. These things are depending on who you talk to and what song or artist or things that you say. But I use Bill Haley's "Rock Around the Clock" as the sort of important, really breakthrough song, there's predecessors to that. Nothing exists in a vacuum, right? I've said that. You'll hear me say it all the time. So it's not always so simple as to say, oh, this is where it started. And the truth is, it even gets more complex when we get into the realities of rhythm and blues and rock and roll. So, but to get to that, to understand the history of American popular music, which then becomes a global popular music, we got to go back to the beginning and at least start to lay down some foundations. So we're going to go back to the 1800s for just a little bit, because we got to grab a few things there. Now, there are a number of things that I want you to be mindful of as we go through this class. I'm going to talk about certain technological advancements, and I'll talk about some of them now. And then if you've had history classes, history classes are often taught war to war to war. And, that's a way to do it, and there's a logic to why it is done that way. But it is important to know when some of the major wars were, excuse me for yawning, it's in the evening, it's been a busy day, where those wars, or when those wars took place. So a few of them: Civil War, 1861 to 1865. World War I is 1914 to 1918. World War II is 1939 to 1945, and we got involved in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And of course, you had the Depression in there. You had other things going on: the Korean War in the 1950s, Vietnam War in the 1960s. Those are the main ones that are into the early 70s. Those are the ones that are going to be very significant. So you're going to learn about Stephen Foster. If you know songs like Old Folks at Home and Camptown Races or things like that, you know the music of Stephen Foster. And Jeannie with the light brown hair, you'll learn about that. That actually predates the Civil War. And there's a sort of interesting, sad story about him because he died youngish and poor when he didn't have, because he was so successful, but he wasn't making the money, and that ties to copyright. You'll learn a little bit about copyright. And so then we're going to jump up a little bit, and this class really follows two paths. So you're going to learn about the African and African American influence, and you're going to learn about the European influence and European American influence, and how they converge and when they converge. And that really stays with us through in this class in a significant way, certainly through to the 60s, okay? So the 1960s. So it's important that you're mindful of those things. So you're going to learn about ragtime, which is a Black influenced music that is influenced by European harmonies, probably most well known with Scott Joplin and Maple Leaf Rag, and you'll learn about that. And then you're going to learn about the roots of the blues. You're going to learn about slave songs, work songs, field hollers, and how that led into what would become the blues. And it's a challenging, difficult part of history. It is part of history, and it's a sad part of the U.S. history. But in the context globally, and this is in no way a justification, it's just trying to give you a bigger perspective. The American piece of slavery is a very small one, not small in terms of the context of here and the impact that it had, particularly on African Americans and all of that, but in terms of the global slave trade. And slave trade goes back long. Whenever you have people that can be over other people, you're going to have oppression and you're going to have slavery. And it's been around since, darn near the beginning of time, and it continues today. And in fact, in terms of sheer numbers, there are probably more slaves currently than there have been in the past, not just through work and things like that, but the sex trade there's a lot of that goes on in the sex trade. That's why it's there's so much darkness to it. Particularly, we don't see it a whole lot here, but particularly in places in Asia and India and things like that, it's very significant and profound. So you basically have these African people that were stolen and sold from their homeland, sometimes even by their own people, and then they were taken captive and became slaves. And the slave trade primarily came from North and West Africa. There was a huge amount of slaves that went north from North Africa that went into the Middle East. But the slave trade that we think of when we're talking about slavery primarily came from West Africa, went across the ocean a lot to Brazil. Brazil and South America was really the number one recipient of slaves. And then it worked its way up through the Caribbean. And so you have it impacting, Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Jamaica and Cuba and into the American South, where it basically ended. And then it was this triangle of slavery that, the work went back and it's its own thing. And it's terrible. It's awful. It's horrible what people will do to other people. But we all know that, and we've been living in that, especially a lot in the last few years, and trying to deal with that and grapple with that. So what happened was you had these slaves that were brought over. They were brought onto plantations. They were, made to work. Here's another important thing that I want to get out, because people talk about, the United States and slavery, and certainly there was slavery in the United States. But when you talk about the history and the roots of slavery in the United States, the United States was primarily British and French colonies. There was no United States yet. So you've got a good 150 years of slavery before you have a United States of America. So, and of course you had people even from early on that were trying to get rid of it, to abolish it. And thankfully it happened. Sadly, there were, things that continued on. And we still are wrestling with it, like I said. So anyways, I bring that up because it's important in the context of this class. You have these slaves that were brought onto plantations that were forced to work. In many cases, they could not carry their own history with them, their own traditions. They couldn't have their own dance, their own music, their own languages. And so there were some places. In New Orleans, there was a place called Congo Square. And on Sundays, a lot of the African slaves that were in that area were allowed to go to Congo Square in New Orleans and actually dance and sing and celebrate their heritage. Eventually that got shut down. And then, Congo Square, I think it's built over now. But what would happen though is you would have these slaves also that some went to church, some that were made to go to church, some that could just hear the music that around them. They could hear church music, they could hear European folk music. And so then those things started to combine and they started to merge. And so what you ended up having were these styles of music that were influenced. And so when you deal with something, especially like, say, the blues, which is so significant to American popular music, to the history of American popular music, what you have is an African experience that becomes an African American experience eventually, that really is brought to life lyrically through chord progressions that came out of a lot of European harmony. And then as the music got more involved in rhythmic, what you had was the influence of African rhythms and American or European harmonies combining, and that's where you get to that. So you get ragtime, and ragtime leads to jazz, and then jazz kind of goes and evolves and eventually becomes swing and the big bands, and then it kind of goes by the wayside when rhythm and blues takes over it. And you're going to learn about rhythm and blues a little bit in jump blues and how that eventually leads us to rock and roll. It'll take us a couple chapters to get there. So you have that trajectory going through, and then you have the blues trajectory going through. So you start off, the blues was very much a rural sort of expression, if you will. So imagine that you're out working, you're working in the fields, and you're using music to get you through. You're using field haulers, you're using work songs. But then you go back to your home, to where you live, and you have a guitar, or maybe you have a banjo, which the banjo actually is an African instrument originally. That's where it came from. But then you would, and eventually then you get a harmonica in blues. Just so you know, we call that a blues harp. So if you hear people say, "Oh, that guy blows a mean harp," don't think like angels and harp, because blowing would make no sense. So that's a harmonica. But they would go back and then they would make music. They would make music to deal with the day, just like we listen to music to deal with the day, and some of us make music to deal with the days. And so you had country blues and Delta blues, which came out of the Mississippi Delta, and those were rural acoustic blues. And then you had a style of blues known as classic blues, which is the blues that you would hear like in nightclubs. So you're going to learn about Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and that, and of course you're going to learn about Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson isn't like the foundation of all of it, because again, nothing exists in a vacuum, but he's a very significant figure in the history of the blues. Eventually what happens, you have that, you have World War I, you have people that go off to fight, some that come back. You have, the end of slavery, and people move around, and you start to have movement that happens into the bigger cities. And then even more so when you get into World War II, you have a lot of people that go off and fight. Not all of them come back, of course. And what you have is people that maybe were born and raised in the South that came back. Maybe they had some money, they had the GI Bill, they had more flexibility, or they've seen more of the world. And so also they go where the work is. And a lot of the work moved away from, the agricultural work of the South into the big cities, into factory work. And so you see a lot of movement into places like Kansas City, Chicago, New York, where the factories are, Detroit, where they make automobiles, right? And so you have this move, and a lot, especially of black folks that they leave the South and they move to the cities and they live in their neighborhoods and they start making their music, and cities are louder and rooms are bigger, and they start to use electric instruments. And so then you get to what we call urban blues, where instead of individuals playing acoustic music, you have small groups of people playing electric music. There is electric guitar, and things like that. And that's another thing that's important for me to mention, because we're going to talk about technological things throughout this class, is that during this time, the technology is developed for electric guitars, for amplification, guitar amps, and for microphones, which are a lot of that is German technology, same with magnetic tape. And PA systems, speakers, public address systems. And by having microphones and PA systems, you didn't have to have the big old operatic style singers anymore. You could have people with quiet voices like Sinatra and, Bing Crosby and Perry Como. And that's where the crooners came out of. So technology is always playing a role, and it's always informing what's happening. And it still does to this day. With streaming and all of that is impacting song lengths and why and how songs are made. So eventually you get into urban blues, then you get into Chicago blues, which is very specific style centered around a record label called Chess Records. So you're going to learn the first of independent record labels. So back in the day, there were really just 3 or 4 major labels. And most of those major labels primarily signed white artists only, and they were geared towards a very specific audience. But of course, there was a huge black population. And so these small independent labels started showing up that would specialize in certain things. So this is really the first one that we'll learn about. Next week, you'll learn about Sun Records, Sam Phillips, and that role in bringing Elvis into popularity. But with Chess Records, that was owned and operated by Phil and Leonard Chess, this is the home of where you have Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf. They all came out of this scene, and it really put the blues on a map. I may have mentioned this before, but another technology that's important to understand is that most people up until this time are still getting their music by way of radio. And up until the mid to late 60s, whenever I'm talking about radio in this class, I'm always referring to AM radio, amplitude modulation, as opposed to FM radio, frequency modulation. FM radio doesn't really become a big thing until like 67, somewhere around there, Tom Donahue in San Francisco. So when we're talking about radio, whenever I talk about, and they listen to the radio, Up until that time, it's always AM radio. And AM radio could transmit signals very far. During the day, the signal was transmitted terrestrially, so it would go from antennas to repeaters basically on the ground. But at night, the way it would transmit, it could actually go up and off the atmosphere, and it could travel sometimes states away. Particularly if you think about the East Coast, the states are closer, they're smaller. A lot of them are anyways. So it changed the way that things were transmitted. Jukeboxes were important to some degree. And then, of course, television becomes a more important role, certainly as we get into the 50s. And so we got to pay attention to those technologies as well. I think next week I'll do my little show and tell with records. Because while that is a big deal and 45s and singles, I'll save that. This video has already been kind of long, but I had to set up the beginning. They won't always be this long, I don't think, but I had to set up the history, the context now that we're getting into the music. So that's that. You will learn about all of those things. I just wanted to establish that. Please get to your assignments early. If you have questions, reach out to me on Canvas. It's better than emailing me. I get notified. Please set up your notifications so that you get emails if I need to reach out to you. And hey, if I send out announcements, read my announcements, okay? Every now and then, rarely, but every now and then, I will sometimes bury little free extra credit points in there. So I may ask you a weird random question in an announcement, and if you answer it, you may get 10 points. I don't know, just something to pay attention to. So I think that's it. I will be in Canada this week. I will be at a conference in Calgary. In fact, by the time that you're watching this, I will be on a plane. And so I will be heading up there, and I will not be back until Thursday night. I will have my phone. I will have access to things. I normally try to get grading done Mondays or Tuesdays. It's going to be very long, busy days for this, so I may not get your first assignments graded early. Depends on how much time I have on the plane and how much time I have in the hotel room late at night. So if you don't get things graded, straight away, that's why. Okay, that's it. It was long. Sorry. Make sure that you answered all the questions that are in here. They all relate to stuff that I say in here or things that you should know. But yeah, that's it. Have a great week. Bye.